The flashing blue and red lights illuminated my backyard like some sort of bizarre light show. I stood in shock as two police officers approached my small observatory dome, their faces stern and unreadable in the darkness. "Sir, we're responding to reports of privacy invasion from this property," one of them stated flatly. I tried to explain, but my words seemed to evaporate in the cool night air as neighbors gathered along the fence line, whispering and pointing. The second officer was already examining my telescope, my pride and joy. A 10-inch Schmidt Cassegrain on a computerized mount that had taken years of saving to afford. "We'll need to take this equipment as evidence," he announced, disconnecting cables without any regard for the delicate calibration. My stomach dropped. They had no idea what they were interrupting. No one did. Somewhere above us, hurtling through the void of space, was Asteroid 2024 KX-3, a recently discovered near-Earth object that NASA had specifically asked me, David Miller, age 48, to track tonight. And now, my data collection was being shut down at the worst possible moment. "Officers, please, you don't understand the importance of what I'm doing here," I pleaded, watching helplessly as they began dismantling my carefully aligned setup. "This is scientific research for NASA. I can show you the credentials and tracking assignment." The taller officer sighed, clearly having heard every excuse in the book. "Sir, you can explain all that down at the station. We have multiple complaints about this equipment being used to observe private residences." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment. As I noticed Mrs. Davenport from across the street covering her teenage daughter's shoulders with a protective arm, glaring at me with undisguised contempt, I wondered how things had gone so terribly wrong. Just 12 hours earlier, I had been excitedly preparing for one of the most important observation nights of my amateur astronomy career. Now, I was being treated like some neighborhood deviant. The officer carefully removed my control laptop, placing it in an evidence bag, while his partner took photographs of the entire setup. "You'll receive a notice about when you can retrieve your property, pending investigation," he informed me coldly. I watched in horror as they closed the dome of my small observatory, a structure I had built with my own hands over countless weekends, and placed evidence tape across the entrance. The neighbors continued watching, their whispers growing louder as speculation spread like wildfire. And standing at the center of it all, barely concealing a triumphant smile, was Karen Wilkinson, clipboard in hand, nodding approvingly as my astronomical equipment was loaded into the police cruiser. I have always found peace in the night sky. While others saw darkness between the stars, I saw possibility, countless worlds waiting to be discovered. My fascination with astronomy began in childhood but blossomed into something more serious 5 years ago when I joined NASA's Citizen Science program. As an amateur astronomer with decent equipment and a methodical approach to observation, I quickly became a reliable contributor to their near-Earth object tracking network. Most people do not realize that professional observatories cannot possibly monitor all potentially hazardous asteroids. There simply are not enough telescopes or staff. That is where dedicated amateurs like me come in, filling crucial gaps in the monitoring network. My journey with NASA began with simple tasks, confirming already catalogued objects, verifying positions, helping with basic orbital calculations. But as my reputation for reliability grew, so did the importance of my assignments. I upgraded my equipment, invested in better software, and even took specialized courses in astrometry to improve my data collection techniques. The community of citizen astronomers became like a second family to me. We shared techniques, celebrated discoveries, and commiserated over cloudy nights that ruined observation plans. There is something deeply satisfying about knowing your hobby contributes to science in a meaningful way. With each data point I submitted, I felt connected to something larger than myself, a global effort to understand and protect our planet from cosmic threats that most people never even consider. 3 weeks ago, I received an email that made my heart race. NASA needed priority observations of a newly discovered asteroid with an uncertain orbit that potentially crossed Earth's path. They had selected just a handful of citizen scientists with the right equipment and location for optimal viewing. I was honored to be among them. The object had been initially spotted by a survey telescope in Hawaii, but its unusual brightness fluctuations suggested an irregular shape and potentially unpredictable movement. My specific assignment was to capture precise positional data during the 4-hour window when the asteroid would be visible from my longitude, data that would help complete the global tracking effort and refine the orbital calculations. Immediately begun preparing my backyard observatory, making sure everything was in perfect working order. I cleaned all optical surfaces meticulously, recalibrated the mount tracking system, and updated my control software to the latest version. I even rehearsed the entire observation sequence the night before, using a similar celestial object to ensure I could capture the required data efficiently once the actual target appeared. I had checked local regulations twice. My modest dome structure was well within height restrictions, properly distanced from property lines, and the telescope itself was aimed skyward, not at any neighboring houses. I had even installed light-blocking fencing to ensure my activities would not disturb anyone. I had been operating this observatory for 3 years without a single complaint from neighbors, many of whom had actually visited during the community stargazing events I occasionally hosted. But none of that mattered to Karen Wilkinson, age 62, the self-appointed enforcer of our Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association bylaws. Karen had moved into the neighborhood just 8 months ago and quickly established herself as someone who took the sanctity of community standards far too seriously. A former corporate compliance officer who had taken early retirement, she approached the Homeowners Association rulebook with the fervor of a religious text. Within weeks of her arrival, she had already cited 7 different homeowners for violations ranging from unapproved mailbox designs to improper hedge heights. Karen's first complaint about my observatory came only weeks after her arrival. Something about it being an unsightly structure, despite it being barely visible from the street and having been approved by the Architectural Committee 3 years earlier. When that failed to gain traction with the Homeowners Association Board, she began suggesting more sinister motives. "What is he really looking at with that thing?" she would ask other neighbors loudly when I was within earshot. "Our bedroom windows are right there." She conveniently ignored the fact that my telescope was housed in a dome with a narrow slit opening that physically could not be pointed at ground level. She began documenting my observatory activities in a small notebook, recording the times my dome was open and occasionally taking photographs from the sidewalk. Once, I caught her standing at the edge of my property line with a measuring tape and a copy of the Homeowners Association bylaws, apparently trying to find some technical violation she could report. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. The rumors began spreading through our previously friendly community. Parents started giving me suspicious glances at the mailbox. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings suddenly stopped. Longtime neighbors who had once enjoyed my impromptu astronomy lessons now crossed the street to avoid conversation. Even my next-door neighbor Tom, age 55, who had helped me build the observatory foundation, began to seem uncomfortable during our previously regular weekend chats. It was remarkable how quickly 3 years of community goodwill could evaporate under the persistent drip of malicious gossip. Karen's campaign escalated with formal complaints filed weekly. First, about light pollution, non-existent, as I used red filters, then noise, my mount motors are virtually silent, and finally, most absurdly, invasion of privacy. She began organizing what she called community safety meetings in her living room, where she showed neighbors printed pictures of my observatory and raised questions about why someone would need such sophisticated surveillance equipment. These meetings grew from 3 or 4 attendees to over a dozen as curious neighbors were drawn in by her increasingly dramatic descriptions of the threat I supposedly posed. I tried reasoning with her directly, approaching her one Saturday morning as she inspected her immaculate lawn. I offered to show her my setup and explain my work with NASA, even suggesting she might enjoy seeing Saturn's rings or Jupiter's moons through the telescope herself. Her response was immediate and cutting. "I know exactly what men with telescopes are really doing. My sister lived next to a so-called astronomer in her old neighborhood, Turned out he was photographing children at the community pool. "Is that what your NASA research is all about?" She turned on her heel, leaving me standing speechless in front of her pristine garden gnome collection. Despite the growing hostility, I continued my observations. The asteroid tracking was too important to abandon because of neighborhood politics. I documented my sessions meticulously, recording exactly where my telescope was pointed each night, always at specific coordinates in the sky, never anywhere near eye level with surrounding homes. I kept detailed logs with timestamps and star charts showing the precise section of sky I was monitoring. I even installed a security camera in my observatory to prove I was only conducting legitimate astronomical research. But Karen was not interested in evidence. She wanted the observatory gone, and she was willing to do whatever it took. After her verbal accusations failed to produce immediate results, she began distributing flyers to every home in Meadowbrook Estates. These single-page notices bore no signature but warned of predatory behavior enabled by unusual equipment in the neighborhood. While never naming me directly, they included a crude drawing of a telescope pointed at a house with a question mark above it. As if this were not enough, she began contacting the spouses of homeowners association board members, suggesting that their failure to act might indicate some form of collusion or inappropriate relationship with me. It was character assassination by innuendo, expertly deployed to create maximum discomfort without making legally actionable claims. The night everything fell apart, I was in the middle of a critical observation window. Asteroid 2024 KX-3 was making its closest approach to Earth for the next 5 years, providing a rare opportunity to refine its orbital parameters. The object had been displaying unusual brightness variations that suggested it might be tumbling rather than rotating smoothly, a characteristic that makes trajectory predictions significantly more difficult. NASA had coordinated a global observation campaign to capture as much data as possible during this close approach, with observers strategically positioned around the world to maintain continuous tracking. My assigned window was particularly important because the asteroid was passing through a region of sky with few bright reference stars, making professional automated tracking systems less effective than a careful human observer who could make real-time adjustments. I had been sending data packets to NASA every 30 minutes as requested, measuring the asteroid's precise position against background stars and documenting its brightness fluctuations. Each successful observation filled me with a quiet pride. This was citizen science at its finest, a global collaboration between professionals and dedicated amateurs working together on a problem that affected everyone on Earth. The tracking was going perfectly until the police cruisers pulled into my driveway, their lights painting my ceiling with pulsing blue and red patterns that ruined my night vision adaptation. As they confiscated my telescope, disconnecting it mid-observation and packing it carelessly into their vehicle, I caught sight of Karen, age 62, standing across the street, arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing on her lips. She was wearing a crisp white cardigan despite the late hour, as if she had dressed specifically for this moment of triumph. Several other neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, and she moved among them, speaking animatedly and gesturing toward my observatory. I could only imagine the narrative she was spinning. Officer Jenkins, whom I recognized from community outreach events at the local school, looked genuinely uncomfortable as he inventoried my equipment. But he still followed procedure with methodical precision. "Can I at least finish the current observation sequence?" I asked desperately. "It will only take 15 minutes, and it's for a time-sensitive scientific project." "Sorry, sir. We have to follow protocol on this," he replied, avoiding eye contact as he disconnected my camera from the telescope mount. "You can explain everything at the station." The ride to the police station was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the back of the patrol car, watching the stars through the window and thinking about the asteroid continuing its journey through our solar system, now unwatched by at least one critical observer. At the station, I tried desperately to explain the significance of what I had been doing. "I am part of a NASA citizen science program," I kept repeating, showing them my volunteer credentials on my phone. I am tracking an asteroid that could potentially pose a hazard to Earth. This is time-sensitive work. I pulled up the NASA Near-Earth Object Tracking website on my phone, showing them the specific object designation and the observation parameters I had been assigned. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair, squinted at my phone screen with obvious skepticism. NASA, huh? And they couldn't afford their own telescope. Had to recruit the neighbors? His colleague, a younger officer with a military-style haircut, snickered beside him. That's exactly right. I explained, growing increasingly frustrated. There are thousands of near-Earth objects that need monitoring. Professional observatories can't possibly track them all. NASA relies on networks of amateur astronomers to help collect data. I showed them the official emails, the tracking software on my laptop, even the specialized camera calibration certificates. The officers looked skeptical. One of them even chuckled. "Never heard that excuse before," he said, sliding a citation across the desk toward me. "Usually folks just admit they were being nosy." The fine was substantial, $500 for alleged privacy. But the real penalty was the loss of my telescope and the critical data I should have been collecting. They informed me that my equipment would be held as evidence until my court date, which was scheduled for nearly a month away. "But there won't be any evidence of wrongdoing," I protested. "Because I wasn't doing anything wrong. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." "That's for the judge to decide," the desk sergeant replied flatly. "In the meantime, I suggest you find another hobby that doesn't involve pointing optical equipment toward your neighbors' homes." As soon as I got home, I called my NASA contact number, hoping someone would still be monitoring it at this late hour. The house felt unnaturally quiet without the gentle hum of my equipment cooling fans and the occasional beep of the tracking software. Through my kitchen window, I could see the empty observatory dome, now sealed with yellow police tape like the scene of some terrible crime. The tape fluttered slightly in the night breeze, a mockery of the scientific work that should have been continuing inside. "This is Dr. Eliza Chen," answered a tense voice after several rings. When I explained what had happened, her professional composure cracked slightly. "You are kidding me," she said, the stress evident in her voice. "Your tracking station is absolutely critical right now. We have a network of only 6 observers with optimal positioning for this object, and you were, one of only 2 in your time zone. Without your data points, we have a 12-hour gap in our tracking." She explained that 2024 KX-3 appeared to be in a state of tumbling rotation, making its trajectory less predictable than initially thought. Every data point mattered for calculating whether this half-kilometer, field-sized rock might pose a genuine threat during future approaches. "I need your equipment back online immediately, David," Dr. Chen insisted. "What can we do to make that happen?" The next morning was a blur of frantic activity. I contacted local officials with NASA's information but met resistance at every turn. The police captain was unmoved by my explanation, stating that the telescope would remain in evidence until my court date in 3 weeks. The Homeowners Association Board, now fully under Karen's influence, sent an emergency notice that astronomical equipment directed toward residential areas was explicitly prohibited, effective immediately. A rule they had evidently created overnight specifically to target me. I even tried reasoning with Karen directly, showing up at her door with printouts of my NASA correspondence and asteroid tracking data. She refused to open the door more than a crack. "I know what I saw," she insisted. "That thing was pointed right at the Weber family's teenage daughter's window. The police have the evidence now." She shut the door in my face. In desperation, I reached out to Dr. Chen again, who conferenced in NASA's public affairs team. Within an hour, they had provided me with official documentation of my role in their citizen science program, including precise coordinates of where my telescope had been aimed during the time in question. Directly at the asteroid's position in the eastern sky, nowhere near any houses. But even with this evidence in hand, I hit a wall of bureaucracy. My court date could not be moved up. The evidence would not be released without a judge's order. I was out of options until a sudden stroke of luck changed everything. Lisa Weber, a neighbor I had barely spoken to before, approached me as I dejectedly checked my mail. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation with Karen yesterday," she said. She said, "My brother works at Channel 8 News. He has been looking for interesting local stories. Would this qualify?" I could have hugged her on the spot. Within 24 hours, I was sitting in front of a camera, explaining the situation to a journalist named Mark Weber, who seemed increasingly astonished as our interview progressed. "Let me get this straight," he said. "An homeowners association watchdog has effectively shut down a NASA-imported asteroid tracking operation because she thinks you're spying on neighbors?" As I nodded, he smiled. "Do you mind if we do a live video call with your NASA contact during tonight's broadcast?" That evening, viewers across our metropolitan area watched as Dr. Chen explained the importance of citizen scientists in NASA's Planetary Defense Network. She confirmed that my telescope had been tracking asteroid 2024 KX-3, which she described as an object of scientific interest requiring continuous monitoring. She shared screen captures showing exactly where my telescope had been pointed during the alleged privacy invasion, approximately 45 degrees above the horizon, aiming at a specific patch of sky where the asteroid was traveling. The segment ended with a sharp editorial question: should homeowners association regulations be allowed to interfere with government-sponsored scientific research that affects public safety? The story exploded overnight. By morning, it had been picked up by national news outlets with headlines like HOA blocks NASA citizen mission. Neighborhood watchdog versus asteroid tracker, science loses. Social media erupted with comments supporting my work, many from amateur astronomers around the country who shared similar stories of homeowners association interference. The Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association page was flooded with angry messages from people across the country. Karen, who had proudly listed herself as the association's community standards enforcement officer on her social media profiles, suddenly found herself the target of intense public criticism. NASA's Public Affairs Office released an official statement expressing concern about the situation and reiterating the importance of their citizen science programs in supporting critical research with limited resources. The pressure mounted rapidly. By the following afternoon, I received a call from the police captain himself, informing me that my telescope would be returned immediately. As a gesture of community goodwill, 2 officers delivered it personally, this time handling the equipment with exaggerated care. One of them even asked me to explain how it worked, seeming genuinely interested. More surprisingly, the Homeowners Association president called to schedule an emergency meeting where they unanimously voted to create a special exemption for scientific equipment used in government-sponsored research. Karen was notably absent from this meeting. As soon as my telescope was recalibrated, I resumed tracking asteroid 2024 KX-3, working through 2 sleepless nights to capture critical data during its closest approach. The NASA team was ecstatic. "Your observations filled a crucial gap in our dataset, David," Dr. Chen explained during our video call. "The asteroid showed an unexpected deviation in its rotation that might have gone unnoticed without your input. The refined calculations confirmed what everyone had hoped. 2024 KX-3 posed no immediate threat to Earth, though it would require continued monitoring during future approaches." NASA publicly acknowledged my contribution during a live-streamed press briefing about near-Earth objects, with the director of the Planetary Defense Coordination Office specifically mentioning my work by name. Reporters descended on our quiet subdivision, and suddenly my small observatory dome became something of a local landmark. The Homeowners Association board sent out a community-wide email outlining new rules that specifically protected scientific equipment and research activities conducted on private property. The message included a stiffly worded apology for the unfortunate misunderstanding regarding my telescope. 2 days later, Karen announced her resignation from the board, citing vague personal reasons and increased work commitments that prevented her from continuing her volunteer role. For weeks, she avoided me completely, taking elaborate detours when walking her dog to ensure our paths never crossed. The final irony came about a month later when I overheard her speaking to a prospective buyer looking at the house next door. The real estate agent was highlighting neighborhood amenities when Karen interjected proudly, "And of course, we have the NASA observatory right here on our street. Very exclusive. The scientist who lives there tracks asteroids for the government." She caught my eye for just a moment before quickly looking away, her face flushing red as she hurried back to her house. I simply smiled and returned to my observatory. There were new asteroids to track, and the night sky was perfectly